The battlefield was a nightmare of smoke and fire. Explosions shook the ground, and the screams of the wounded filled the air. Bodies, both human and alien, lay scattered across the ruined landscape. The war had been raging for months, and no one expected mercy from either side. Lieutenant James Carter moved carefully, scanning for survivors. As a field medic, his job was not to fight but to save lives. His orders were clear: help only Allied troops. The enemy had left their wounded behind, just as the humans had. There was no time for kindness in war. Yet, as he stepped over a fallen soldier, something caught his eye. A small figure lay curled up against a broken wall. At first, he thought it was just another casualty, but then he saw movement, a faint rise and fall of breath. James hesitated. The figure was an alien, a child. Her dark purple skin was smeared with dirt and blood. She wore a torn uniform, barely covering her frail frame. Her people, the Zarnath, were at war with humans. They were the enemy. His training told him to move on. His orders told him to leave her. But she was just a child. James clenched his jaw and stepped closer. She was breathing, but barely. Her wounds were deep, burns along her arms, a gash across her forehead. She must have been caught in the crossfire. She whimpered as he knelt beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, large, golden, and full of fear. "It's okay," James said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm here to help." The girl weakly tried to push away from him, but she had no strength left. She trembled, her body tensing, as if expecting pain. James pulled out his medical scanner, quickly assessing her injuries: internal bleeding, fractured ribs, severe dehydration. If she didn't get help soon, she wouldn't survive the hour. He exhaled sharply. If anyone found out he was helping an enemy child, he would be in serious trouble. His own squad wouldn't understand. But he couldn't just leave her. "All right, kid. We're getting you out of here," he muttered. He gently lifted her into his arms. She was so light. She barely even reacted, too weak to fight, too close to death to protest. As he adjusted his grip, he noticed something on her wrist, a symbol, a mark of nobility. James' stomach dropped. This wasn't just any alien child. She was someone important. And that meant the war was about to get a lot more complicated. The rain had started to fall, a slow drizzle that mixed with the blood and ash on the battlefield. James Carter kept his head low, moving quickly through the wreckage, the alien girl cradled in his arms. Every step felt like a risk. If his squad saw him carrying an enemy, they would never understand. She barely moved. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin felt cold. James tightened his grip, shielding her from the rain. His medical instincts screamed that she needed treatment now. But where? His squad's medical tent was out of the question. The moment anyone saw her, she'd be executed, no questions asked. He needed somewhere hidden, somewhere safe. An abandoned supply shack lay just beyond the ruins. It wasn't much, just a metal shell with broken walls. But it would have to do. James slipped inside, laying her down on a makeshift cot. "All right, kid. Let's see what we're dealing with," he muttered. He worked quickly, pulling out his medkit. The burns along her arms were severe but treatable. He cleaned the gash on her forehead, sealing it with biofoam. But the internal damage was worse. He needed advanced equipment, something he didn't have out here. As he worked, she stirred. A soft whimper escaped her lips. Her golden eyes fluttered open, locking onto him. She was awake. James felt a pang of relief. "Hey, you're all right," he said, keeping his voice low. She stared at him, confusion in her tired eyes. Her lips parted, and she whispered something in her language. He didn't understand the words, but the fear in her tone was clear. "You're safe," he assured her. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Her breathing quickened. She tried to sit up but winced, clutching her ribs. James gently pressed her back down. "Easy, you're hurt," he said. She flinched at his touch but didn't resist. She was too weak to fight. James sighed. "What's your name?" Silence. She just stared at him, wary and exhausted. James tried again. He pointed to himself. "James." Then he pointed to her. She hesitated, then whispered, "Lyrian." James gave her a small nod. "All right, Lyrian, you need rest." But she didn't relax. Her gaze darted toward the entrance, her body trembling. James frowned. Then he heard it too. Footsteps outside. Someone was coming. And if they found her, everything was over. James held his breath as the footsteps outside grew louder. His mind raced. If it was one of his own, he could maybe talk his way out of it. If it was an enemy patrol, they were both dead. Lyrian's breathing quickened. Her golden eyes darted toward the doorway, her fear almost tangible. She knew the danger as well as he did. James grabbed his sidearm, but kept it low, hidden. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wouldn't go down without one. The footsteps stopped just outside. A shadow passed over the doorway. James tensed. "Carter." The voice made his stomach drop. It was Corporal Diaz. James quickly covered Lyrian with a tarp and stood, stepping into the entrance. Diaz frowned at him, rifle slung over his shoulder. "There you are," Diaz muttered. "We've been looking for you. Found any survivors?" James forced himself to stay calm. "No, just wreckage and bodies." Diaz squinted past him. "Then what are you doing here?" "Got caught in the blast wave. Needed a minute to clear my head." Diaz didn't look convinced. His eyes drifted toward the shack. "Mind if I take a look?" James tensed. "There's nothing in there." "Then you won't mind if I check?" Diaz stepped forward. James moved to block the way. Diaz's expression darkened. "Carter, what's going on?" Before James could answer, a faint sound came from inside. A soft, pained whimper. Diaz's hand went to his rifle. "Who's in there?" James had seconds to decide. Lying wouldn't work. Fighting Diaz wasn't an option. He exhaled sharply. "She's hurt. A kid. I couldn't leave her." Diaz's jaw tightened. "An alien?" James nodded. For a long moment, Diaz just stared. Then he took a slow step back, glancing around. "You realize if command finds out, they'll shoot both of you," he whispered. "I know." Diaz exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Damn it, Carter." James didn't move. If Diaz reported him, this was over. But then, Diaz did something unexpected. He reached into his pack and pulled out a water canteen. He tossed it to James. "Make sure she drinks," he muttered. Then he turned and walked away. James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Lyrian peeked from under the tarp, her golden eyes wide with confusion. James sighed, shaking his head. "Guess we just got lucky." But deep down, he knew luck wouldn't last forever. James watched as Diaz disappeared into the smoke-filled ruins, his heart still pounding. He had expected a gun to his head, not a canteen of water. Lyrian slowly sat up, wincing as she shifted her injured ribs. She glanced between James and the doorway, her golden eyes filled with uncertainty. "You not tell them?" she asked in broken English. James knelt beside her, opening the canteen and handing it over. "No, not yet, at least." She hesitated before taking a sip. Water dribbled down her chin, but she drank greedily, her body desperate for it. "Why?" she whispered. James leaned back against the cold metal wall. He had been asking himself the same question. He had every reason to leave her behind. Orders, survival, common sense. But he couldn't. "Because you're just a kid," he finally said. "And I don't leave people behind." Lyrian stared at him, something shifting in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but something close. James exhaled, rubbing his face. "Listen, I need to move you. This place isn't safe. If patrols come through again, they'll find you." Lyrian tensed. "You help me escape." James hesitated. Helping her now was one thing. Helping her escape, that was treason. If his superiors found out, he'd be court-martialed. Maybe worse. But when he looked at her, wounded, scared, abandoned by her own kind, he knew his answer. "Yeah," he said. "I'll get you out." She blinked, as if she couldn't believe it. Where? James thought for a moment. He couldn't smuggle her into a human base. That was suicide. But there were old tunnels beneath the ruins, left over from the first battles of the war. If he could get her there, she might have a chance. "There's a place," he said. "But it won't be easy. You think you can walk?" Lyrian gritted her teeth and nodded. "I try." James helped her up gently, supporting her as she stumbled forward. She was weak, her legs trembling under her weight, but she refused to stop. "Good," James said, "because we don't have much time." A distant explosion rocked the ground beneath them. The war wasn't over yet, and neither was their fight to survive. James led Lyrian through the ruined city, keeping low as they moved between collapsed buildings and burnt-out vehicles. Every step she took was unsteady, her breathing labored, but she didn't complain. She was tough, tougher than most kids he'd met, human or otherwise. He scanned the area. They needed to reach the old tunnels beneath the ruins. If they made it, she'd have a real chance at survival. A sudden noise made him freeze. Voices. Human soldiers. James grabbed Lyrian and pulled her behind a broken wall, pressing a finger to his lips. She understood immediately, curling into a small ball, her golden eyes filled with fear. Two soldiers passed by, their rifles slung over their shoulders. "Command says we push forward at dawn," one of them muttered. "Wipe out whatever's left." James' stomach twisted. If they didn't get out soon, Lyrian wouldn't have a chance. The soldiers stopped a few feet away. One of them kicked at a pile of debris. "Still can't believe they just left their own behind," the second soldier said. "Damn cowards." "Good for us," the first one scoffed. "Less of them to fight." They walked off, their laughter fading into the distance. James let out a slow breath, then turned to Lyrian. She was trembling, hugging her knees. "They leave me too," she whispered. James clenched his jaw. He wasn't surprised, but it still made his blood boil. "Well, I won't," he said. "Come on, we have to keep moving." Lyrian nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. She struggled to her feet, and together they pushed forward. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the tunnel entrance, an old maintenance hatch half buried under rubble. James pulled it open, revealing a dark passage leading underground. "This is it," he said. "We get inside. We're safe." Lyrian hesitated at the edge. "Dark," she murmured. James pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on. "Not anymore." She managed a weak smile, then followed him inside. As James closed the hatch behind them, he knew this was only the beginning. Getting her to safety had been hard. Keeping her alive, that was going to be even harder. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. The tunnel was cold, damp, and eerily silent. James led the way, his flashlight casting long shadows on the cracked walls. Lyrian followed close behind, her breathing shallow but steady. "How far?" she whispered. "Not sure," James admitted. "These tunnels are old. Some lead out of the ruins, some don't. But it's our best shot." Lyrian nodded, gripping his sleeve. Despite her exhaustion, she kept moving, refusing to slow them down. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, a faint noise echoed from ahead, a low, metallic hum. James motioned for Lyrian to stop and killed the flashlight. Footsteps. Mechanical, steady, not human. Drones. James pulled Lyrian into a side alcove, pressing her against the wall. The hum grew louder. A dim red light flickered down the tunnel, scanning the passage. A patrol drone. If it spotted them, alarms would sound. They'd be trapped. Lyrian tensed, holding her breath. James barely breathed himself. The drone hovered closer, its sensors sweeping the area. Then, just as quickly, it moved on, its red glow fading into the darkness. James exhaled slowly. We have to move. Now. They pressed forward, deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, the walls narrowing. James' mind raced. If the enemy had drones here, the tunnels might not be safe for long. After what felt like hours, they'd reached an intersection. One path sloped upward, the faintest breeze drifting down. That's our way out, James said. Almost there. Lyrian's legs trembled. I can keep going. James was about to answer when a distant explosion rumbled through the tunnels. Dust rained from the ceiling. Lyrian flinched. They come. James listened. Footsteps. This time, human. Soldiers. They're sealing the tunnels, he realized. They're gonna bury everything down here, including us. Panic flickered in Lyrian's eyes. James grabbed her hand. Run. With the last of their strength, they sprinted for the exit. The tunnel shook as another blast roared behind them. Light, faint, but real. The surface. James pushed Lyrian ahead. Go. She scrambled up the slope. James followed, his muscles burning. A final explosion rocked the passage. The tunnel collapsed behind them, just as they burst into the open air. Coughing, covered in dust, James pulled Lyrian to her feet. They had made it. But the war wasn't over yet. And now, the real fight was about to begin. James and Lyrian stumbled away from the tunnel entrance, coughing as dust and debris settled behind them. The ruins stretched before them, bathed in the eerie glow of fires burning in the distance. The war was still raging. James glanced at Lyrian. She was exhausted, barely able to stand, but her golden eyes still burned with determination. We can't stop here, he said, scanning the area. They'll be looking for survivors. Lyrian hesitated, then pointed toward a distant ridge. Old camp, before war. James nodded. It was their best option. Let's move. They weaved through the ruins, keeping low as they made their way toward the ridge. James' every instinct screamed at him to stay alert. If human soldiers found him helping an enemy child, he'd be labeled a traitor. If alien forces found them, neither of them would survive. Minutes stretched into an hour. Every step was a battle against exhaustion. Then, as they neared the camp, James spotted movement ahead. Figures silhouetted against the night. Armed. James pulled Lyrian behind a broken wall, gripping his rifle. He didn't want to fight, but he wouldn't let them take her. The figures stepped closer. Then James saw the uniforms, human soldiers. His heart pounded. Lieutenant Carter, a voice called out. James' grip on his weapon tightened. A familiar face emerged from the shadows. Sergeant Owens, one of his squad mates. Relief flooded through James, but it was short-lived. Owens' gaze shifted to Lyrian, his expression hardening. You've got some explaining to do, Carter. James stood his ground. She's just a kid, Owens. She was left for dead. I couldn't. He shook his head. I wouldn't. Owens exchanged glances with the other soldiers. You know what command will say. James exhaled. He knew. Saving Lyrian had broken every rule. But he didn't care. Then let them say it, he said firmly. But I'm not handing her over. Silence hung between them. Then Owens sighed. You're a damn fool, Carter, he muttered. But a good one. He motioned toward the camp. Come on. Before anyone else finds out. Relief washed over James. He turned to Lyrian and nodded. We're safe. For now. As they walked toward the camp, James knew this was only the beginning. The war wasn't over. The galaxy was still divided. But tonight, one act of kindness had defied it all. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward something greater.